All right, guys, pernicious anemia is our next topic here. The way I like to remember pernicious anemia is that guy from Lord of the Rings, Gollum. You know, he's always going like this, precious, precious. So I like to remember that because there's so many types of anemias out there that it's like hard to keep track of which one's which. So if you guys remember precious in terms of pernicious anemia, you're going to remember that it's really almost it's very close to your GI tract that Gollum rubs his hands. So that helps you remember that pernicious anemia starts with the GI tract. So pernicious anemia is all about your body not being able to absorb the tools needed to make red blood cells. That's my red blood cell right there. To make red blood cells inside the bone marrow. Now, if you know anything about how blood is made in your body, it's really actually quite simple. It's almost like going down to your hardware store and let's just say you're building a birdhouse. Well, for a birdhouse you need wood, you need nails, and you probably need a hammer to nail in those nails and then hang it on the tree, right? So all the birds can come. So what are our tools? What is our wood and what is our nails for our birdhouse? Or basically our red blood cell? Well, for our red blood cell, if we're going to make a red blood cell, we need iron, okay? We also need B12, cool, and we also need folate, or in the clinical setting, we usually give our patients folic acid. And folate and folic acid are the same exact thing, really. Folate is just the naturally occurring vitamin. Folic acid is something that we produce in the lab that's called synthetic. So we need these three things to make our bird house, or basically our red blood cell. If we lack any of these three things, we're not going to have enough building materials to make our red blood cell. So we're going to have low red blood cell counts, leading to our anemia, okay? So there's really an entire breakdown of maybe your patient has bad bone marrow. Maybe your patient has not enough of these. Maybe your patient does have enough of building material, but it can't absorb it inside the GI tract. That's exactly what's going on here with our pernicious anemia. So I always break down the pathophysiology for you guys. So we know that these three are our main culprits, okay? I'm sorry. Our main building utensils here. So inside of our stomach, how do we absorb all these materials? And specifically for pernicious anemia, keep on dropping these, we lack the ability to absorb B12 specifically, okay? This is why your patients need that B12 injection instead of absorbing it through the GI tract. So what happens, how do we get pernicious anemia? Does it all of a sudden just, we can't absorb B12 all of a sudden? Not so. Inside your GI tract, you have little cells along this stomach here. Oh. We can call these little cells, okay? Man, you can't even see that. Oh my gosh. Let me get my red pen out. How about that? Okay. We have little cells along the lining of our GI tract. Now these not your whole GI tract. Your stomach lining has gastric parietal cells. And write that down because you need to know that specifically almost for all the drugs you give, because gastric parietal cells is the main responsibility of pumping out gastric juices and things that help break your food down. It's also the main culprit for, if it overproduces acids, it's going to cause a either gastritis or heartburn or GERD and cause the degradation or deterioration of the lining if there's too much. So that's why we'll give your patient H2 blockers, PPI inhibitors, or those two mainly locate and focus on these guys bring down the acid production. But I'm being very ADD right now, and I'm sorry. But for pernicious anemia, your gastric parietal cells, they secrete something called intrinsic factor, okay? You need to write that down if you did not know what intrinsic factor is. I'm going to tell you what it is right now. So intrinsic factor is a protein that your stomach gastric parietal cells make, and this intrinsic factor is a mechanism of helping B12 digest in the GI tract, okay? So intrinsic factor is produced by your gastric parietal cells. This intrinsic factor takes B12, so we'll say this is intrinsic factor, intrins, takes B12 and helps it to digest in the lower GI portions here, okay? Without intrinsic factor in our lives, we're not going to be able to digest B12, and if we don't digest B12, we're not going to be able to make our RBCs, and if we can't make our red blood cells, we're going to become anemic, and we're going to have a low blood cell count, okay? So, what causes us to not make enough intrinsic factor? Because that was what we're lacking with pernicious anemia. We're lacking that intrinsic factor from our stomach cells, our gastric parietal cells. Well, if we don't have enough functioning gastric parietal cells here, let's just say your patient has a long history of gastritis. Gastritis is a burning at the lining of the stomach. So let's say we've lost a few gastric parietal cells. Let's just say that our gastric parietal cells are there, but they don't actually produce that intrinsic factor that grabs our B12 and helps it digest. Maybe it's a genetic thing. Maybe it is we're causing basically too many harsh chemicals, too many toxins in our body. What if we're drinking and boozing it up too much? What if we're smoking it up and eating way too many fats or way too much caffeine, and we're actually burning our lining of our stomach and causing a degradation in our gastric parietal cells? So it could be a trauma thing. It could be a genetic thing. But mainly we see our patients, mostly a genetic thing with our pernicious anemia. But not to say that you're not going to be tested on patient education with your patients with GERD, with your patients with gastritis, because this is one of the main factors or one of the main risk factors that your patient could get. Because think about it, if we've pretty much burned our lining of our stomach, we're burning all the mechanisms that help us to absorb the building blocks to make not only red blood cells, but we're basically destroying everything that helps us make everything else in our body. All of our nutrients, all of our vitamins. How are we going to get into our body without the GI tract, without the oral tract? No, we're going to have to put it in our muscles. Put it in our subcutaneous. And that's what we have to do with your patients. We have to give them B12 injections for the rest of their lives inside their booty, and that's going to help your patient to not become anemic and lose all of their, basically have a low blood count. Because if you ever had an anemic friend, you know that they're always trying to eat iron all the time, and iron is one of the building blocks. They'll have to get the B12 injections, probably take supplemental folic acid, and they always look pale and tired because they don't have that oxygen from the blood circulating through their body. So educate your patients, but first of all, know exactly how to educate them by telling them to stay away from those risk factors that cause gastritis and GERD.